those extremes you see in Brazil are amazing, and they are biblical. What's the cause of all this that's going on? Is it just mystique? Is it God? Well, it's a pattern, and extinctions, for sure, are a pattern. They're a long-term cycle. But you're looking at a simulation animation by NASA of the helium focusing cone. It says it right there on the picture. Helium focusing cone. Well, they quit showing you that picture because we found out where the helium was coming from. It was coming from a binary star, our sun's twin. Only it's not much of a twin. It's 10 times the size of Earth, but it does have a strong magnetic field as strong as Jupiter. Notice the helium is depicted coming from one direction. That means we're not in a cloud or an ocean. That means that there is a stream and a source of the helium. And when we thought this brown dwarf was crossing the ecliptic, right after it crossed the ecliptic, we had the largest, single most brightening of the corona of the sun on the Mauna Loa instrument. This is an Earth-based telescope, white light. We look at it every single month to see what the helium focusing cone was doing. And it became more of a disk or a donut that went around the entire sun, no matter what direction you were looking at the sun from. And this corona just lit up right about that time, which we said it should, and it did. But, you know, to prove there's something extra in the solar system, the tides would be the place you need to look. Man has a hard time controlling the ocean. It may want to try to control the atmosphere, but the ocean is the ocean. And when you do a search on king tides, it's very confusing, but especially the first line here. The annual king tides are right on time, flooding coastal streets with salty seawater, and it will get higher with each decade. Now wait a minute. What causes king tides is the moon, the supermoon. So why is it annual? What is it going on in the solar system that king tides are annual? Very, very suspicious, very confusing. But what isn't confusing is when the ocean comes leaping in, springing forth, and the phenomenon just keeps getting more frequent and with higher and higher tides. Now you can't tell me raising the ocean a half an inch will make your tides come springing inland, sometimes a half a mile, the ocean coming in. That's biblical. And if there were tidal changes and extreme tidal shifts, then the rip current deaths would skyrocket. We made a warning about that in 2014, maybe even 2013. We made a video chronicling the rip current phenomenon and the rip current deaths, and we started to see a trend of increasing death. And you should just Google rip current deaths for your coastal state and see what has happened. They're getting rip currents in the Great Lakes, not just any rip currents. They're sucking people out and pulling people down and drowning people. Usually described as an isolated current, when you're caught and being pulled out to sea by outgoing water, they want you to relax, take your time, swim parallel to the shore. Sooner or later, it will spit you out. But any longer, anybody who gets an aerial view of these coastlines can see that the the riptide phenomenon is not isolated. It's widespread and uniform. That implies a bigger force at work, creating dangerous beaches, which were not so dangerous once upon a time. So the oceans are like the thermometer for an oven. They're like a thermostat. The oceans respond to tidal forces the way that a thermometer responds to heat, and it tells you what's happening. Now, this brown dwarf we're certain is a fragment, and the fragment we think is about 10 times the size of Earth. That's a very, very small brown dwarf. Its magnetic field is huge, but it does affect the orbit of the moon. And 30 years ago, I promise you this, you never heard the term supermoon. Okay, now somebody will chime in on a YouTube, of course, and say, oh, I've heard of supermoons way back when. But the bottom line is that term came right along with something else that's new, and it's called king tides. And the king tides sprung forth and rushed inland almost tsunami-like, almost like a tidal surge in front of a hurricane. But whatever's causing the supermoons surely has to be related to the increased energy and brightening of the sun. When you take a picture of the sun through a filter, it should change the color of the sun. It is so white hot that it still shows up white, even when you take a picture under a filter. White, it's 5th grade science. You guys, this is 5th grade science. White is hotter than yellow. And that's really all you need to know. So tying the two in together was easy, because we had earthquakes, we had solar wind, we had magnetosphere. But when we told people this thing was passing directly underneath Saturn and Jupiter, which were just separated by a very short distance, traveling underneath Saturn and Jupiter, as soon as those words left my lips, this lady took pictures through her video camera of Saturn. Precisely at the same time, we said this thing was in between Jupiter and Saturn. And those suspicious light beams we know are electron exchange. Electron exchange from one object to another, like static electricity from the tip of your finger to the tip of somebody else's nose. Snap, crackle, pop. So we took this video, we put a double layer of outline on it to really highlight the changes in light. And you can see there's a plasma buildup outside the rings of Saturn. It's acting just like plasma. And when you get the electrons, enough electrons in between Saturn and this brown dwarf, they will exchange electrons. This is a discharge, and we know it's not a light anomaly because it's not affected by the movement of the object across the frame. In fact, the light moves more than the object, and it almost, if you slow it frame by frame down, it almost looks like these beams are traveling and not just flashing on like a bulb, that they're actually extending out one direction or the other. What would be happening at this precise moment in this video taken by this private astronomer is that the brown dwarf, we know, is laying on its side. Its poles are east and west, and the rings of Saturn are an electron magnet. It's dust, ice, and even partially melted ice water. Those are spinning in the disk system, just like any cloud in a spinning magnetic field. Spinning itself in a circle creates a magnetic environment. And the rings of Saturn, just like a cloud, have a polarity on one underside and a different polarity on top of the rings. And therefore, the east and west pole of that brown dwarf is freely, each pole is freely to exchange electrons back and forth to this ring system, charging it, discharging, charging it, discharging. And this was the perfect storm. And if there are more electrons there, there have to be more electrons everywhere. You can't just be shooting electrons at Saturn. So Earth's magnetic field is putting out electron jets. Those are not protons, creating that spiraling, tangled ejection of a ball of electrons. We go to another electron instrument just to see what it looks like, and you can see that instrument warps the entire magnetic field for a split second as these masses of electrons just show up instantaneously and get drawn into our magnetosphere. When that happens and there's an overload being packed into our magnetosphere, sooner or later the repelling force of electrons takes over and ejects these electrons like a spinning ball into the tailstream. And poof, there they go. And we know they're not protons because protons compress and ripple your magnetosphere. They do not expand your magnetosphere. But the repelling force of electrons does. So there's electrons everywhere. There, I just proved it. And it's bizarre stuff happening. So with all this extra energy, we've been warning you about the sun baking the earth since 2012, I think. We made that statement. And now mainstream's talking about the deadliest part of the hurricanes may be the heat that follows. And we mean deadly heat. Killer heat. And new research identifies deadly hidden hazard. But no, we are in extremes. There are also cold temperatures. This wind chill in Elk Park, Montana in May, yeah, giant Arctic vortexes are trying to cool the planet. They're trying to grab air, these Arctic vortices, from way up north, as far north as the North Pole, and spiral it down to southern latitudes. Meanwhile, grabbing hot air near the equator and pulling it back up to be cooled. Where? In the North Pole region, the Arctic. That is going to melt the ice, and the methane will be our nemesis as well. But the extremes, oh my, the extremes. Whenever there's been a really long, pronounced drought, prepare for the flood. And then, how quickly did the California's drought abate? And how quickly did it come back? Wow, one season. This is some warnings from a very old video. So if you were watching this channel, you knew all of this was going to be going down and getting worse and worse and worse. And here we stand today, and the scenes being played out around the globe are heartbreaking. And I mean, it's mind-blowing to see people dying in their cars on streets that they parallel parked on for 30, 40 years. Never seen it, and then one day you die in a flood on your street. Your street becomes a death trap. Where you walked your dog, where you had a curbside parlor and had a lunch next to that street. Now you would die if you were having lunch there. And these flash floods, some of them are simply caused by one thing only, the monsoon rain. Many of the floods, though, are created by warm rain on melting snow. And the debris coming down this torrential flood happening all over the world, all over the world. The debris acts as a battering ram and can destroy bridges in a matter of seconds. And these kind of debris-filled flows are next to impossible to survive. And if you're not tuned in and tuned on, you could get caught by one of these. You could fall victim. And remember when this all started for me was the very first biblical rains in Australia. My mouth dropped open seeing people's entire parking lots being swept clean of cars while people watched helplessly out their work windows. I mean, you're talking about commercial areas completely leveled by raging floodwaters. That is kind of biblical in a sense, wouldn't you say? And the crop losses, they're manifesting in higher prices. We all see the higher prices. So we really have to become more and more self-sufficient, more and more prepared. We have to be extremely careful about everything we do in life, because the heat can get you, sudden monsoon can get you, hailstones can get you. Oh my goodness. It's just horrific. And if it was caused, of course, if all this was caused by warmer temps, because warmer temps cause what? Evaporation. So you would predict bigger rainfall totals, more precipitation in a warming climate, not a cooling climate. You got to protect yourself from this energy being created around the earth, being created in the corona of the sun, being created out in space when the particles collide with one another. A lot of energy coming from a lot of sources, but all of it attributed to more particles flying through the solar system at incredible speeds sometimes, coming in contact with the sun's wind, creating heat, more heat. The water temperatures of the Great Lakes and the water temperatures of the oceans both are at record levels. So we know the entire water of the globe is warming up, and we know it's the sun. And remember, there never used to be things as supermoons, and there never used to be spring tides. So what does this magnetosphere have to do with tides? Everything. It's all symptoms of the same object. The tidal influence, the cosmic rays are screaming a second star, a second sun, albeit a fragment of a brown dwarf, thank goodness. But it came through, it cast its evil cosmic rays upon us, and now we're going to spend the next 3 or 4 years trying to cling on to life.